I'm going to talk about declarative, and we're going to go over some basics, talk about how you can get insights locally on the client to help troubleshoot what's going on, what's been sent down, kind of a little peek behind the scenes to try and figure out what all this craziness is. Apple's pretty clear that they're prioritizing DDM going forward. At WWDC this year, they announced a couple of new things, some more software update functionality and the disk management stuff that is DDM only. So we can kind of expect that going forward, and the old MDM stuff will kind of just maybe die by attrition over the next few years. I took a screenshot of this because I don't know if it's going to show up, but this talk is one long live demo. I have this Mac set to have a forced install at 10:12, 3 minutes before the end of this talk. So we'll see what happens. Just go with it. This is a sequel of sorts to the talk last year. If anybody's here, I believe it was in the same room at this same time slot too, where we explored similar techniques in troubleshooting MDM commands, specifically for software update. And I note that there are 244 views on this, which is kind of terrifying. I also just considered taking that video and just dubbing in the words DDM over MDM and just playing it again, but that sounds like a lot of work. And also I hate listening to my own voice, and I can't watch that. So that was a terrible idea. But I also asked ChatGPT to summarize it for me. And that didn't go over very well either. This is what you get when you train those LLMs on the internet, right? So instead, I just copied the slides over because I basically knew I had the length right and edited them as needed. So enough of that nonsense. Let's talk about declarative. Again, Apple's making it clear that most of their management stuff going forward is going to be DDM first and DDM only. We can expect them to continue doing that over the next couple of years and kind of phase out the old stuff. MDM is still important because it's what sends the declarative management down to the client. So it's not going to go away forever, and they can just continue to coexist. So what is declarative? The platform deployment guide has some nice documentation. The DDM is basically kind of a scaffolding built on top of the MDM foundation. And then all your vendors, the vendor ecosystem, they all take what Apple provides and they build their own customizations around it with their own take on the concept and provide that to you, the admins, which then goes down to the users and has their own special user experience. The vendors are all hard at work integrating DDM into their platforms right now. So you're starting to see some announcements about availability of especially the software update stuff. You can kind of think of DDM as asynchronous, kind of a desired state style of management versus the kind of polling back and forth management of MDM. Tom famously refers to it as management over UDP. DDM also changes the way that it receives information back from the clients. It subscribes to statuses from the clients rather than sending a command and then waiting for a response. So at a high level, classic MDM, your server requests that Apple tell your machine that it has something for you to do. And then Apple sends a push notification that says, hey, I don't know who you are, but I heard a rumor that the server back here wants you to do something. You might want to go and figure out what that is. The client then reaches out and says, hey, what's up? I heard you've been talking about me. And the MDM server says, oh, it's you, right? Yeah, here's this thing you need to do. And then the Mac goes and does that thing. So this kind of round robin approach has some struggles. There's network latency. What if the machine is asleep? Relying on timely information from that from one of the device info commands or something before it can send another command. You end up with this kind of loop back thing going on. Declarative simplifies that quite a bit. It still uses MDM to send down the initial declaration, but then once that's done, the config lives locally on the client and then reacts locally to changes. So in this case, you simply tell the Mac that I want you to do this thing. If you're on less than 14.5, I want you to update to 14.5 by 10:12 a.m. during your talk. And then the Mac will handle all those details on its own. And then, of course, the Mac sends the status directly back to the server through the status channel. And the server can subscribe to specific topics that it's interested about. And then your MDM may provide you with that information as the admin. To make it even more useful, these status items can then be reused as predicates to control the declarations that are on the system. So it's kind of a nice little self-perpetuating engine that happens on the machine that can kind of make its own decisions. But again, MDM still has to send down that initial command. So even if you think you can just kind of move to DDM only, you still need MDM for that initial part. So I kind of like to consider that at Apple, when they came up with this whole declarative thing, they were thinking about the philosophy and determinism, where each successive state is just a result of its prior state between the configurations and activations. And I thought about going down this path a little bit more for this talk, but again, that sounds like a lot of work. And also, we're all Mac admins, so that would just lead down the path to talking about fatalism, and I don't know if I can deal with that this morning. So moving along, more of the documentation. Since DDM is a subset of MDM, all the docs are up in the same location on the Apple developer site. And while the docs are tailored towards MDM vendors and developers, it's useful for us to kind of have an understanding of this stuff and to read over these docs so that we can provide better feedback to our vendors and to Apple. One thing I want to call out here is, again, it says it doesn't interfere with MDM behavior, but in some instances it kind of does, because if you start using DDM for things like the new software update settings that they announced this year, or even the software update enforcement declaration, once you start using that, the old legacy MDM commands stop working. The clients actually send kind of an error of sorts back to the server saying, hey, you sent me an install later with deferrals, but we've got this DDM thing set up, so let's hold off on that and do it this way. So declarative is made up of a collection of assets here, or of components. The ones I want to kind of focus on are the configurations, the assets, and the activations, and how they kind of work together to create the declaration on your client. Configurations I think of as kind of analogous to the classic MDM configuration profiles. You kind of give them keys and values. Assets are collections of data that you can asynchronously download from a resource within a configuration and install on the client. And that's the mechanism behind the service configuration files that they announced last year, where you can lay down config files into a SIP-protected directory. And this year, they're expanding that to include launch daemons and executables, which is pretty nice and will be interesting to play around with. Activations are how these configurations are triggered. And those can include these predicates or kind of a conditional that turns that configuration on or off, given on the state of the machine. So for example, the passcode settings documentation here will lay out all of the keys and everything that you as a developer or us as admins who are curious about this can look at and see what makes up a declaration. And just like the MDM stuff, they show you the OS versions that it was announced with. So it's pretty easy and clear to figure out whether this will work on your fleet or not, depending on what OS level that you're on. The passcode settings were announced in macOS 13. And DDM even has an option to install what Apple is calling legacy profiles, but we just know as configuration profiles, right? That word legacy is really interesting there and telling. This means even if you're not using DDM for any of the configuration files or the software update enforcement or anything, you potentially could move all of your configuration profiles into DDM, have it push them out, and then take advantage of the rich information back from the status channel, which would be pretty useful. Currently, there's only one type of activation, as far as I know, the activation simple. But the power here lies in the predicates. And it's kind of similar to how the OS log and querying unified logs works. You can pass predicates to kind of filter things. You can put a predicate in an activation to trigger the config to be on or off, right? For example, you can limit your config to only run on Macs that are on a specific OS, or only on a device type, only iPads, that sort of thing. You can kind of think of activations as like smart groups, maybe. It's just a categorization style, but it happens locally on the machine. And if you want to dig deeper into this configuration stuff, Apple publishes the entire schema on their GitHub page, which is pretty cool and very useful. It's in a structured format, YAML files that you can import and categorize and analyze with your own tools. You could even set something up that looks for changes to this repo, does a diff, and tells you what is new, what they just added. And I believe they have beta stuff in here as well, like a beta branch. So it's a really useful resource, especially for your MDM vendors, because they can look at that and kind of see, okay, that's the stuff that's coming up this fall. We need to go and start implementing that. And then for you as an admin and a customer, you can use this information to then go to them and ask for support or enhancement requests. The schema is pretty straightforward. Like I said, it's a YAML file. And it's kind of similar to the developer docs page on the Apple developer site as well. But it's in a structured format that, again, you can import and analyze. In this example, it's the software update enforcement declaration, and it tells you the minimum OS that it was introduced in as well, so you can automate that. And it gives you, it tells you which keys are required and which ones are optional. For this declaration, the only required ones are the target OS version and the target local date time. So that's the version of the OS that you want the clients to be on and the date that they have to install it by, the deadline. It also includes the optionals. So you can optionally have a URL that people can click on to get more information. And you can optionally have the build version of the OS, which is useful for testing betas because the version doesn't change, but the build does. So you can use that to enforce beta 3 of Sequoia on your fleet if you want to. It also includes the status items that the server can subscribe to, which is useful because then you know what to go look for when you're kind of poking through logs and on the server console, because the server can optionally choose to subscribe to like the failure reason, install reason, and the install state there. And we'll get into kind of these details a little bit later. But first, I want to talk about open source. As an admin, there are ways for you to dive in and kind of start playing around with this stuff, including some pretty cool repos on GitHub that are built and maintained by members of the community. some in this very room. MicroMDM was created as kind of a implementation of the MDM protocol to kind of poke around and see what it was all about. And it grew to, include more functionality, including like depth and enrollments and stuff. And so it can be used as a full-fledged MDM. And of course, it's free and open source, so that's kind of enticing. But the maintainers of the repo famously put up a flag on there that says this is not a product, it's more of a research project, kind of. But it's very useful for getting familiar with the MDM concepts. Oh, it doesn't show. I got the pop-up. NanoMDM is a more focused MDM server, and this was created by my coworker, Jesse Peterson. It's based on MicroMDM, in which he also had a hand in as well. It brings about better scalability. It's extensible. You can have other components that you can kind of plug into it. I kind of think of it as a bring your own SCEP server type of project. And he's built some other plugins like the Nano Dep and the Nano Command to kind of add more functionality. But the idea behind Nano was, of course, to make it more contained, and for us, the important thing was making it scalable. Nano is what we use at Meta for managing all of our Macs. KMFDDM. This is another project that Jesse wrote when DDM was announced for macOS a couple years ago, or maybe last year. And he built this as a plugin for NanoMDM, so they can work in conjunction. And it's mainly meant as like a resource too, but it also is fully fledged. You can use it in the product as well. And I believe some commercial MDMs are using Nano and KMFDDM as well. KMFDDM also has kind of some opinionated concepts in there on top of the DDM stuff, such as like sets, like ways of categorizing and organizing your clients. So Jesse's put a lot of thought into that. And then finally, the Mac Admins open source organization. Our friend Nate here, my coworker Nate, has some example DDM configs that you can look through and play around with. And so we'll be getting into that here in this talk. If you're not familiar with the Mac Admins open source organization, it's a nonprofit, and they host a lot of popular community open source applications like Nudge and Outset and install applications, and the new SOFA API for querying macOS update information. It's a really, really great resource, so I encourage you to go and participate, open issues, do pull requests, add projects, bother Nate, he loves it. It's a really incredible resource. And they have some of the apps that are in there, like Nudge, are signed by a certificate that this open source nonprofit has generated with Apple. Pretty sure that's right. If you want to experiment with the DDM examples, Nate and I will be available after this talk in the hallway, and I think we're gonna try to find a table or two at lunch to kind of hang out. So feel free to come up, introduce yourself, talk to us, and he can help you get set up with a test MDM instance on the server that he has, and so you can actually play around with this stuff. So this is what that DDM testing repo looks like. You can, when you get an instance, an MDM and DDM instance set up, you can use that with the KMFDDM tools to kind of interact and play around with these configurations and assign that to like a VM or test device or something. It says right there that this is an insecure setup, which is true. And also, Nate's the one that has all the access keys, and he's really not trustworthy at all. So you probably want to use a VM or a Mac that is a tester and not connected to your corporate infrastructure. I use this old MacBook Air here that doesn't have any work stuff on it to do the testing for this talk. So here's the boring part. What do the declarations look like? Like I said, there's components, and the ones I'm going to cover are the configs, activations, and assets. Here's an example of the SSHD service config file declaration. And the key thing here is the identifier. All of these identifiers kind of tie together, and that's how they all know about each other and speak to each other and kind of create the entire declaration that goes down to the client. And the benefit of managing a file through a declaration is that it gets saved on disk to a SIP protected directory. So you can kind of think of this as a way to tamper-proof some of these config files, like for SSH or bash. But you can also supply your own files. So if you have a configuration file for one of your own internal services, you can deploy that via one of these configs. It'll get sent down and installed into a SIP protected directory. So you can now finally tamper-proof some of your own stuff too, which is pretty exciting. The caveat here is right now, in Sonoma, it's just like config files, text files basically, but they're adding support for launch daemons and executables in Sequoia. So that's pretty exciting. So you can foresee a future where maybe the Jamf agent is in a SIP protected directory and your users can't just delete it from their system when they're trying to be nefarious. And we can expect Apple to add more file types to the system configuration over the years. And if you have any ideas, of course, send that feedback to them. I'm sure they'll love it. Like I said, the identifier is the important part here. And we're referencing the asset identifier that we'll see in a second. So that ties the two together. So that's how they know about each other. The activation has a very similar structure, and it has its own identifier. And then it, in turn, references that config identifier. So now we're starting to see how they all are aware of each other. Then the asset file itself, or the asset declaration itself, has that identifier that the config knows about as well. And it also contains a URL for the zip that contains the file that you want to deploy, and a hash of that file that the MDM client will use to verify it's downloading what it's supposed to be downloading. And like I said, you can manage your own files within this service configuration declaration. So, almost anything you can think of, you can throw down your OS query files, your configs for Chef or Puppet if you're doing configuration management, maybe even like a monkey local manifest, so they can't change that. There's a lot of creativity that you can get into here. And like I said, the stuff coming out with executables and launch daemons is going to be very useful as well. And again, the identifiers can be anything you want. Nate just calls this my service on the example page. As long as you're just referencing that between the activation and the configuration and potentially the asset, they will all know about each other. And this is where it starts getting kind of interesting. You can throw a predicate into the activation of the declaration. These words get very hard to remember which one's which. And I'm probably saying half of them wrong. I can see Lucas judging me right now. I'll go back one. The activation on the previous one, nah, I won't go back. If there's no predicate, it's just true, right? Because it's just this activation simple. You're laying it down, and it's not failing any test, and so it's just going to be true across the board. But if you want to only activate that config under a certain condition, you can use a predicate. And the cool thing about this is that all of those status reports that it sends back to the server, those can be repurposed for predicates. So here we're using that status, the built-in status for File Vault, and we're only going to enable this config if File Vault is true. And this is great because if File Vault suddenly becomes false because somebody turns it off, then that config will be removed from the system. Which actually is, after I put this together and did some testing, is not quite true for the File Vault one specifically, and I submitted feedback on this, but that one needs a reboot before I can figure out that has been changed. You can use other statuses, such as the operating system version, which is kind of cool. So if you're doing, say, the OS install enforcement, you can say, only run this if it's on any 14. Sonoma release. The problem with this, and we have feedback on this as well, is it's a string comparison. It doesn't do like a version comparison, so you can't say less than 14.5. You kind of just have to string them all together. And speaking of that, you can string them together with ands and ors. Again, it's very similar to what you're used to with the log command. And there are other built-in statuses for like the device model identifier and battery health in this example. These are all documented on that site and on the GitHub, the built-in ones. And potentially you could start using these in conjunction with some of the management configs that your server can send down and start building things that are kind of analogous to LDAP groups or something. But all of the stuff happens locally on the machine. And then finally, we get to the asset declaration of this service, which of course references the identifier, again, of that config, has the URL for the zip file that you want to install and the hash there. Configs are very cool, but they're just one thing that you can do with DDM. Some of the newer announced stuff at WWDC is exciting around being able to control all of the software update settings as well as the enforcement and the disk management. But next, I want to talk about our favorite topic, software update. Last year, Apple made a big announcement at WWDC where you can now have a declaration that manages the desired state of the OS on the system, which is very cool. And you can give it a deadline, which they have, you're giving the user some grace to be able to do the install on their own. When it hits that deadline, that grace goes out the window and it forces a restart and does the install for them. You can include a URL for help information, like an internal KB or something, so that they can have confidence that this is something that the organization wants to do and is planning on doing. So if we look at what those declarations look like, it's very similar to the service config ones, but there's obviously not going to be an asset involved in this. You give it the target OS version and the target local date time, the deadline. Those are the only two keys that are required again, but you can include a URL and the build as well if you want to be more specific about which build of that particular OS that you want to install. And Apple's built in a very nice user-facing interface for this, where they get system notifications saying, "Hey, your organization wants you to update your Mac. You have until July 11th in about half an hour to do it." And they also provide information in other areas that are user-facing that the user can find out the information and have more context about why this is being required. If we look at the activation, it's again very simple. And similar to the config files, it references the identifiers there, and it has its own. And so that config and the activation are tied together. This isn't using any predicates, so if you push this down to the clients and they're not on 14.5, they will start getting prompted to update to 14.5. So once you create that declaration, how do you get it down to the client, right? The KMFDDM repo has some pretty useful tools in the tools directory that give you some interactive ability with your MDM and DDM server to be able to push the stuff down to the clients. So one of them is this API declaration get. And so this is just asking the server, the DDM server, what that declaration is supposed to look like for that client. In this case, it's the same information, the 14.5, the build number, and the target date that it gets back. So you can kind of use this to maybe verify that the client sees what you want it to see. And again, this matches the keys that are in that declaration. So it's a great way to kind of pull this stuff into your own reporting and verify that the stuff is working the way that you think it should. If we query the status of the declaration, we'll get a blob of JSON back that is all the status reports that the server is subscribing to. By default, KMFDDM subscribes to the management and I can't remember which other one, but you can optionally add in these keys for the software updates, install state, and that sort of stuff. So then you start getting that rich information back from the clients about what they're doing now that you've instructed them to run that update. And it'll give you some information like whether that configuration has successfully been activated on the client and the date that it last received that status. This is an example of one where the activation is failing for some reason. And so you get an active state of false, valid is unknown. And then it shows you the error down there. It just says has errors. But if you look through the entire output in here, you can kind of scroll up to the configuration and it might tell you exactly why it's failing. In this particular case, I was testing out the bash service config file declaration, but I forgot to include the asset into the declaration. So I was just sending the config and the activation. And so it didn't know where to get the zip file from. So it was throwing up an error there. Once I added that back in, this changed to true and everything worked fine. There is a API for getting the last report from the client that was sent to the server. And in this example, this is after I sent down the software update enforcement declaration to the Mac. It sent back a report saying that it was preparing an install, and the reason that it was doing that was because of the declaration. Now, this reason code is pretty interesting, and the install reason itself is pretty interesting. You know, this says declaration, so you know why the Mac is doing what you instructed it to do. But Apple documents all of the possible components here that can be returned in that install reason. And this is really great. This is something that I've wanted for a long time, because with MDM, often if there was a failure doing an update, it was kind of hard to figure out why the update had been attempted. Was it the user running it? Were they using the command line? Was it MDM initiated? So this gives you all that information back in the install reason, including MDM and declaration. So you'll know whether, even if you're not using the software update enforcement declaration, right? If you're not using DDM for enforcing software update, you can still subscribe to this, and it'll tell you that whether the install that's happening was triggered by MDM or was user initiated. So that's really good information for providing feedback to Apple if you're submitting a bug. And there's also the same thing for the install state. So when you send down this declaration, the client gets it, it's activated, it says, cool, I'm gonna go do the thing, it starts downloading it and preparing the update, and then it alerts the user that there's something available for them to do. And so you'll start to see each of those steps coming through the status channel as the machine is processing the update, all the way down to when it starts actively installing it. It'll send a status report on that, and also if it failed, it'll report that, and then you can start poking around and trying to figure out what went wrong. And we'll get into that a little bit more later. As I said, most of Apple's documentation is targeted towards vendors and developers, but it's good for us as admins to stay up to date, because then we can provide better feedback to our vendors and to Apple. Having an understanding of what happens behind the scenes, gives us more tools in our shed to be able to troubleshoot and maintain our fleet. So on the client, if you're managing those service configuration files, they all get shoved into this directory under VARDB managed configuration files. And like I said, this is a SIP protected directory, so it's tamper-proof. Even root can't delete these files. They can read them, so they can copy them out and play around with them, but you can be sure that they won't be able to delete, say, if you're managing the bash profile here, they won't be able to just delete that from the Etsy folder or whatever. They're owned by a service account called RMD, which is the remote management daemons user. And you can see the POSIX permissions here are all read-only. So again, even root can't edit or delete these files. And you'll notice the directory names correspond with that identifier of the config. So this all kind of ties together, right? So you can have multiple configs laid down, and this directory will just be full of all those identifiers based on the folders. And inside those folders are the files that were provided by that zip that was downloaded and installed. This is showing the example of the bash profile, and then also the custom myconfig file that is on the DDM examples repo. And you can read these files. You can check the hash of them and make sure it's all up to snuff. But these are the files that are in that test repo up on the Mac Admin's open source site right now. So if you play around with it and you start pushing these things down to your client, you'll see these exact same files. For software update itself, there's this neat file under VARDB software update that is a plist. It's a binary plist. And if you print it out, it gives you a lot of information about that declaration, including those keys, right? The OS that you want it to be on and the target date. If you are feeling creative and enterprising, you might realize that this looks kind of similar to the nudge configs. And if you're using nudge in your org, you could potentially query this file and reuse what DDM is declaring to then send to nudge and give your users, the more rich interactive view that nudge has. But the thing to remember here is this file is not immutable. So if you're worried about your admins jumping in there and changing that date to 1960 and then they never have to update, that may not be a good idea for you. This is a little counterintuitive, but all of the declarations are listed inside your MDM enrollment profile, including the configuration files with the path to the directory that they're laid down in. It's kind of nice because when you send the declaration down, how do you know it worked, right? You can go look at the files themselves, but you can also just look at this and it'll tell you exactly what the Mac thinks it's supposed to do based on all those declarations. These are for the configuration files, but it also shows the software update declaration here. And again, it's the required keys and the optional key here, the build version, because I think I added that in there. So you can quickly look on the client inside the config profile, the enrollment config profile, to see what the client thinks it's supposed to do. And even after you update to 14.5, this will still show in there. It's just no longer going to be doing anything, right? Because it's not going to be active anymore. And this is useful too because in my testing, I've noticed that quite often the system notification can get confused. When I flew out here, I changed time zones, and the system notification started telling me that I was going to have to do this update at 1:12 instead of 10:12. But then I looked in here, and it still said 10:12, and then after reboot, the system notifications figured themselves out. And I've seen in the past where if you send a declaration down for a software update, and then you change it maybe to 14.6 or something, and you send it down before they had a chance to finish that one, sometimes these things get confused and get out of sync. So it's good for troubleshooting and screenshots to provide to Apple if you're providing feedback to be able to see this here. And even better, inside the system settings software update pane, Apple adds information for your user telling them which OS is expected to be installed and also when it is to be installed by. And I like this a lot because, who looks at system notifications, right? People just dismiss it or they're in Do Not Disturb. But if they happen to come across, they see the flag in here and they go and look at the software update pane, now they'll see very clearly, oh, this is something that my organization expects me to do. It's not just Apple nagging me, it's the people who pay my paycheck, right? And it has that help URL, so that's custom. In this example, it's just Apple, but you can put in a link to your own internal interweb to give them more information about what's happening there. Also, I really like the kind of passive-aggressive wording there. Your organization has decided. Here's what it looks like when that notification triggers. They get a system notification, and then I'm just showing that the enrollment profile there has the same information in it. Those notifications get more frequent as the deadline approaches, kind of similar to Nudge as well. I already have another one here on this one. And they start bypassing Do Not Disturb, which I believe is true because it's bypassing it right now on my screen. So that's kind of useful. It's certain to make people hate you even more, but at least it's working, right? Last year, in this session, I talked about using unified logs to look up and troubleshoot information about DDM commands. And so this is the obligatory reference to last year's reference to the talk that I did back in 2017 on unified logs. I'm not going to go over all that stuff again because I assume that you've all done your homework and you're all caught up on the Chilcote cinematic universe. But I'll just talk about some basics. The log command can be used to read existing logs on the machine, stream logs as they're generated. But the cool part is the log collect and show archive. You can collect a log archive file, and you can ask your users to collect that on their system and provide it to you, and then you can run the log command against that log archive file and then get the historical record of that machine. And so you can limit that to give me the logs from the last 5 minutes or something if they're seeing a particular issue. And then you have a much shorter amount of data to sift through. And the easiest way to get a log archive is through sysdiagnose. This is probably why Apple is so adamant that you include sysdiagnose in your feedbacks and AppleCare tickets, because it comes with a full log archive from the system. So it's a pretty comprehensive amount of data that's saved in there. Not everything that gets streamed to unified logging gets added when you do a log show like this, but it gives you a lot better information, and it's much easier than asking people to run a log command themselves and then send you the output. You can also download debug profiles from Apple site for things like 802.1x or the managed client that will turn on more verbose logging for those services. So if you're specifically troubleshooting something and there's a debug profile available for that, it's a good idea to install that. You can also turn on the debug mode using the log command as well for any of those subsystems that you're looking for. And that's useful for, again, just providing richer information back to who you're giving feedback to your vendor or to Apple. So looking at logs, our old friend MDM client is there still doing DDM stuff now. This is an example of where it is downloading those zip files that were configured in the asset declaration of the bash and that custom my service file. So this is useful. So you can see exactly when MDM client went and pulled down those zip files, and then that gives you so if something went wrong with it later, then you can say, well, it downloaded here, what happened to it? It got removed, and then you can go and troubleshoot and figure out, oh, my activation had a predicate where file vault was set to true, now it's false, and so that file got removed from the system, right? The remote management D process is very interesting too. The thing to look out for here, just like with any unified log stuff, is it's very verbose. This Mac was set up like a week ago, and the screenshot was only a couple days later, and it already had over 8,000 lines in the remote management process. But this is very good information for troubleshooting, and you can poke around, look for common words, and then you can start filtering on those words, and start building up a repository of log commands and log predicates that you can throw at your system to try and figure out, try to tell the story of what DDM has been doing. This is a fun one, and strangely enough, this actually came up in Slack earlier today. The com.apple.su for software update, I suppose, subsystem has a category of DDM now. And this is really cool because it shows all of those or very similar information that your MDM server gets through the status channel. It's also logging to unified logs here. So in this example, the client itself is logging the fact that the reason it is preparing an install is because of a declaration. And then it gives that install state initially there as none, which at first I thought was something was wrong. But I think that was just because I had just sent the declaration down and it hadn't had a chance to go and see if the update was even available, so it didn't know whether it was available or not. But pretty soon it changed to downloading, and then we also started seeing the version, the pending version and build, and the target date time as well. So this is really good information, and again, you can start telling a story about the Mac, right? So it'll say downloading. When it downloads, it's also doing that prepare mechanism, which is really useful because, especially on Apple Silicon, because you don't want your users to sit there and have to wait for it to prepare for, it says 30 minutes, but nobody ever really knows how long that takes. But once they get alerted that there's an update available, that prepare phase is already done. So they can hit restart, and on Silicons, that only takes a few minutes, right? So it's a really, really good user experience. And again, the install state will change to prepared once the update has been downloaded and prepared. And then when they get that notification and they hit install, or if they hit the deadline and they get the countdown, which hopefully we're going to see, this will change to installing, right? And then that status gets sent up to the server, but you can also query that locally on the client, which is useful if you're just troubleshooting why an update failed to install on a Mac. We definitely have time for this. One interesting thing last year is we were looking at unified logs for MDM commands like the install later and the force and start. And one of the words you can look for, one of the keys you can filter on is the OTA abandoned. And that generally happens when an update is attempting to do an install and then it gives up if it bails at some point. The information that you get in the unified log is a little opaque. You get a error number and then kind of an error explanation here. It says controller error commit stash invalid state, but who here knows what that means? Well, I'm sure he does. What's that?
It doesn't have the volume unlock key. It doesn't have the volume owner.
Possibly, yeah.
To reboot and perform the authenticated reboot to install it. Can you repeat the question for the
It was more of an answer. He described the next slide. But I came across this little gem recently. There's a file inside the software update Mac controller framework, which is a plist. And if you look inside that plist, it has all of those error codes, including a human readable explanation of what it is. So the other day, I wrote a little script and threw it up in a GitHub just to kind of play around with this plist and see what it does. So if you run it without any arguments, it'll just spit out all of the English language errors associated with those error codes. If you pass it, oh yeah, this is my favorite, and I definitely empathize with that error. If you pass it that error code, it'll tell you the reason why, and this gentleman had that perfect. The reason was the credentials were not available to the update at that time. But you might think, were there any credentials? Because it was an MDM command, right? So I'm pretty sure what this means is the bootstrap token itself was not stashed and available for the update. And that's something that we ran into a lot with Monterey era updates. If you throw a bunch of errors at it, it'll just spit all of them out. I went into our log aggregator and pulled the top errors that we've seen in the last couple of weeks. And so now I know in a more human readable way what problems we're seeing most on our fleet. And then you can use this information to try and go and figure out why these things are happening. Most of it is like, network timeouts and stuff like that. But again, this is good information for when you're providing that feedback to your MDM or to Apple. You can kind of say, hey, here's the time stamp in the logs where the problem was occurring. Here's the error. And, judging by this file, this is what it seems like that error is. And, so you're kind of helping them along and trying to figure out what's going on there. All right, moving on. So, like I said, your MDMs are all currently hard at work integrating DDM into their management systems. And they're all, doing great work in customizing the look and feel for you as an admin, making sure the user experience is going to be good. But it's always interesting to see how they approach it a little bit differently. And we did this last year with the MDM commands. And so I want to do it again with the help of some friends in the room here. I got some screenshots and logs that we can poke around in. First up is Kanji, and their interface is very clean. I like this, and it correlates tightly with the DDM settings, right? So you have your minimum version, you have the enforcement deadline. It's very straightforward. You know exactly what you need to enforce. There are other options in here as well. But it's nice that they kind of make it, again, they make it clear that this is a declarative software update management rather than a classic MDM setup. You have the minimum version and the deadline date. And in this example, I believe they let this run to the deadline, so we'll see what that looks like. But again, inside the enrollment configuration profile, it has the information about the software update declaration, and then the user gets these pop-ups, the system notification pop-ups telling them when the deadline is and which OS that they're expected to install. Looking at that plist file, it has that information, the date and the target version. So on the client, you have all these different ways of figuring out what the expected information is from that declaration to be on that client. Looking in the logs that they helpfully gave me, looking at that software update DDM category, the machine started downloading the update immediately. And again, this is really great because this means it's taking care of that prepare phase, so the user doesn't have to sit there and wait for it. And then it changed to prepared, of course, when it was done. So that takes however long, 10 to 30 minutes or something. And that changes to prepared. So as a vendor, they know that that machine is now ready to run the update. And if you're troubleshooting locally on the client, you can query the unified logs to get that same information. When the deadline hit and they started getting the countdown, that status in the logs changed to installing. So again, that's really slick. It tells you exactly when. So now you have a timestamp, right? You know exactly when it was triggering the install. Next up is simple. And ironically, they're a bit busier in the interface, but that's not a bad thing. They give some nice options here. Latest minor, latest major, or you can specify a minimum version. So you could potentially say, I want 14.3 to be installed, but we're not ready for 14.4 or anything like that. They add in a relative date, which is kind of cool and interesting, and I was curious about this. 21 days after public release. So I assume that means 21 days after the public release of the update itself. And we'll see how that looks in the logs in a little bit. And then enable additional days until the update, enable additional days until update for devices that enroll. So I believe what that's doing there is they don't want you to enroll and then immediately get triggered with a 1 hour enforcement and then get forced to install that right away. They give you a couple of days of a grace period there. And again, the user interface, the software update system settings pane will start showing that prepare phase as well. So if they come across that, they'll see that that's actually in progress right now. They get the pop-up saying that it's scheduled for an update by a specific time. And then inside that config file or that plist file, again, oh, and Rick, I see what you did here with the details URL. You get the target date and the target OS. The target date is interesting because 14.5 came out on May 13th, and the deadline is July 2nd, but that's longer than 21 days. So I'm not quite sure. They might be putting some more padding in there or something, because I think 21 days before July 2nd would be like, what, June 11th or something? So I'm not quite sure what the discrepancy is there, but having that relative date option in your console, I think is a very nice option for them to add for you, because then it just kind of takes care of itself. So you can say, always keep my fleet on the latest minor by within 21 days of when that release has come out. Then you don't have to go in there and keep saying, okay, now we're on 14.5, now we're on 14.6, and et cetera. So that seems like pretty great. And one thing to note here on both of these is they don't include the target OS build, and I don't know if that's in the interface. It might be. But again, that would be useful if you want to start enforcing your beta testers to be on the latest beta. You can say you have to be on this build of Sequoia by this date. The logs, again, showed when the machine was downloading the update. And then in this case, I believe he hit update when he got prompted. And so that changed to installing. And the fun thing here is the reason changed to system settings. Why is it not declaration, you might wonder? I believe it's because he actively hit the button and then went to system settings and said, okay, I'm ready to install now, and hit install. So if you're thinking that you're going to get a response telling you that ultimately the reason that it was done was because originally there was a declaration, that may not be the case. It might, that status might change depending on the actions of the user. So that's something to keep in mind. And then this week, Jamf announced DDM support, and Marcus helped me get some screenshots for this. So they have a similar interface here for choosing the target date. The interface on the client, again, is showing the download of that update in the system settings. And they get a, in this case, he was already overdue. And so I believe the user experience when it's overdue is it'll give you an hour before it requires the update. And then, of course, if you just keep rebooting, within an hour for the rest of your life, it'll just keep giving you an hour. But who has time for that, right? So in this case, it was overdue. So if he just waited an hour, and I think he did because it did kick off the update, then it'll kick off at that next pushed out deadline time. And again, that config file or that plist on the system has all the information, and they do include the target build. So that tells me that Jamf is ready for doing beta testing as well with Sequoia using the enforcement stuff. They provide some admin-facing feedback in the console itself. So as the server is getting these status reports from the client, they're choosing to expose some of that to the admin, so you can poke through and see those statuses as they come through. And the console has some other kind of nice information about the progress of that update, including the install action. It says they're declarative. They're very clear about this being a declarative action and not a classic MDM action. So yes, this is all great. I think all three of them are doing great work. It's very clear what's going on. DDM, in my experience, is way more reliable than the classic MDM commands. So if you've held off on using that stuff within your MDM, I'd encourage you to start testing this because it does work much, much better. And that takes us to the end. I want to thank my friends Rick, John, Eric, and Marcus for all those screenshots. All of you Apple folks here at the conference and back working hard, thank you for everything you do. This stuff is awesome. We see you and we appreciate you. And Charles, thanks for being a friend and mentor. I'm going to miss you. Thank you. Do we want to do Q&A or do we want to do a little demo? Anybody have any pressing questions? All right, let's try this out. I'm not going to do that. Could you toss it back to him?
I may not ever be able to repeat that catch. So for when you're pushing out software update commands via DDM, I'm assuming you're going to have to push out new ones for every, new commands for every OS version. Do you need to cancel out the previous ones, or can you just push out a new one and the OS figures out what to do?
Yeah, it should overwrite what's on the system. And even after it does the update, that declaration still exists on disk. So it'll be there no matter what when you send a new one out, even for a new OS. In the Sonoma days, I don't know if it's still a problem, but I did run into bugs where if you sent down a declaration for, say, 13.3 or whatever, and then 13.4 came out the next day, and you go, oh, I'm going to send down 13.4 now. Sometimes it got a little confused, and it wouldn't pick up the change. And that might have just been an interface thing. Maybe the functionality was actually working, and I submitted on that. But no, it should update that information for you on the client. And the vendors are going to be taking care of that for you, right? So especially if you have that option for a relative date in minor OS, that's all you need to do. And it'll just keep sending out that declaration, a refreshed one, every time there's an update.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else?
So just a tip from when I've been testing, if you remove the declaration, like if you want to repeat that and try over and over, if you do it before the 10-minute countdown, it won't actually take hold or take effect on that. Remove the declaration, you can push another one over top of it, then try a different test or however you want to adjust it. Just a tip.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? So we've got 6 minutes until this thing is supposed to reboot itself. Who thinks it's going to work? Come on.
What base OS are you on?
Yeah, is it 14.4?
What OS am I on? Oh, yeah, it's a good question. 14.4.1, yeah.
I think it'll work if you don't.
I'm not going to do anything. Yeah, I think it will. This has been super solid in my testing. The only problems I've run into is, again, if I've been pushing down a declaration with a deadline that's already been passed. What I've observed is the notification will pop up, and it will say, it'll say something like, an update to macOS 14.5 has been scheduled for a week ago, which is a little confusing grammatically. And then when you wait until all of the download and prepare and everything happens, it just doesn't do the update. So that's a bug that I think we've submitted on. Hi.
Hi, thank you. What would you say is the, taking into account that the machine may need time to download the software update before it's forced to reboot, is there a suggested minimum amount of time that you should give the user before that update is due, like 1 day or 4 hours?
I mean, how much do you want them to hate you? Right?
Well, I mean, obviously I wouldn't do that, but like it needs to, so I guess in the next question, sort of related to that is, once you send that declarative command to initiate a software update, does the machine immediately start downloading the update in the background then?
Yeah.
Okay, so it should be ready within a couple hours.
It should, yeah. Yeah, and that's the nice thing about it too, because then when they're ready to run the update, they don't have to wait for that prepare stuff. I think what we've settled on is we give them several days to do the update on their own. We don't want to just start nagging people on day one. And then we start nagging them for a couple weeks, or depending on the severity of the update. And of course, things get more aggressive as time goes on. So I imagine we'll do kind of a similar approach with the DDM stuff.
But like when we're using Nunch right now, and so when we tell our users to go update, they go click the button, and then it downloads the update and then prepares it. That's
Yeah.
the second stage, which takes another 15, 20 minutes, and then it reboots. So is the preparation happening leading up to the deadline also, or does the prep start when the reboot initiates?
It starts when they get the declaration.
Okay.
So if you're setting a deadline 2 weeks in advance, it'll do the preparation now.
Okay.
Yeah. Of course, I don't know what happens if a new update comes out and you change that declaration. I assume it'll just prepare the new one and discard what it had done.
Anybody else have a question?
Someone's going to get hurt.
I was wondering, assuming that your MDM supports DDM already, is there a way to, and I guess it might be MDM specific, to know, like at a high level view, what machines are now switched over to DDM? Or like in my MDM, I know, and I might be doing it poorly, I have to look at each one individually to identify, okay, yeah, this one is DDM. But is there supposed to be an assumption that if you're on Sonoma or above, no?
The question is there an assumption that DDM is already activated if they're on Sonoma or above? No, the server has to send that declarative management command, MDM command, down to the client to kind of initiate it. So just enrolling in MDM does not enroll you in the DDM part of it by default, unless they add that as part of the enrollment tools that happen at enrollment time, which is probably what everybody is doing now. Because again, even if you're not using the software update stuff, you can still get that status back for the MDM commands too. But as far as like maybe returning information about which percentage of the fleet is utilizing DDM, that's implementation detail through the vendor, right? So they can provide that information back to you through the statuses or through their own reporting.
Are you supplementing the DDM declaration with anything else for software updates? Or are you getting pretty good uptake on updates just along with the declaration?
Well, it's a trick question because we're not actually using DDM updates yet on the fleet. It's only in testing currently. So we're still using Nudge and nagging people to death, which is very effective. So there's no there's no urgency really, and so we're trying to make sure we do it right. What's that?
10, 9, 8, 7.
Oh, did it work? Yeah, there's no countdown, is there? Oh, there's a restart button. I didn't do anything. Is this a known issue that on a separate display it doesn't show the countdown or anything? Anybody know about that? No.
The icon it's supposed to start pulsating right after the last bit.
Can you fake send an email while it's restarting?
What's that?
Fake send an email while you're restarting? I'm kidding.
Oh yeah. I'll start editing these slides real quick and see what happens.
Put in a ticket about this mysterious dialogue that's just popped up.
Yeah.
As it restarts.
So
Excuse me, my computer's saying it's restarting.
so those of you who said it would work and those of you who said it won't work, you're all correct. Apparently.
Do you have, it looks like you have caffeine.
That shouldn't matter.
Oh, okay.
I think I saw a hand. Yeah.
Hi, yeah, so my question's about power. I know that it's usually 50% when it's or up to 50% before it can reboot. But if people are kind of always under that, does it log it as like not enough battery?
I know that's a really good question. I know in the MDM command days, it was using that, what was it called, Core Duet decision making. Yeah. Is it different with DDM?
So you can still get the information about why something failed out of
Yeah.
You can still get the information about why it failed in terms of power out of Duet Activity Scheduler, even DASD logs. So again, predicates are your friend.
Yeah.
All of that stuff is gonna be scheduled, and it will tell you
And I
pretty
think
human readable in the log why it failed, if it had to do with power.
it'll in those days it would show you something like a decision made, not pending or something, but that was looking at a bunch of different factors, if the lid was closed and stuff like that. I think in silicons it's not 50% too. It's
20, yeah. I was just going to say, that's the, Apple gave guidance that Intel's 50, Silicon's 20. The other thing I was going to say about someone asking about if you could send an email or whatever during it, it will let you continue a Zoom call, and your video will continue, but you can't see anybody when it goes.
Oh,
Just fun fact.
Fun. Yeah. Yeah. Don't make some faces there.